Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Russian President Vladimir Putin is in China for a two-day visit at a time when the two countries celebrate the 75th anniversary of diplomatic ties. In their talks, Chinese President Xi Jinping said the two countries were furthering their relationship as good neighbors, good friends, and good partners. Where do China-Russia relations stand in today's complex and ever-changing world? What role does the relationship play in global stability and the development of a multipolar world? Join us for our discussion today, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Jinduo. Joining me today are Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Security and Strategy, Tsinghua University, and Kireeva, Associate Professor at the Department of Asian and African Studies, Moscow State Institute of International Relations, Professor Diesen from the University of South-Eastern Norway, and Leonid Savin, Chief Editor of Geopolitica.ru. Welcome. So, Zhou Bo, I'll start with you. So far, the two leaders have met and talked the relationship and also the issued and a joint statement about the bilateral ties. In particular, I would say forward-looking in the next few years, if not decades, about the relationship. So, what do you make so far of the visit?
I think this visit is extremely important, not only because it is to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the diplomatic ties, but actually it is a kind of a continuation of an agreement reached between President Xi Jinping and President Boris Yeltsin that the two heads of states of the two countries should have a regular exchange of visits. So that is why we have seen all this kind of exchange of visits on alternative basis. China and Russia are largest neighbor to each other, and we have enjoyed a good relationship. And I'm sure, given the current international situation, there should be plenty of things for them to talk about. And of course, they talk about the political, issues. But I'm also happy to see, particularly that we two countries decide to actually increase the share of our own currency in bilateral economic transaction. That, I believe, is a major move that might be followed in days to come by other countries.
Mm-hmm. Well, Anna, you have been following, China-Russia ties recently. How do you describe, what kind of achievements, that had contributed to this development of this relationship?
Russia-China relationship is a strategic partnership which is based on a very deep alignment of interests. There is a number of common interests, such as striving for a multipolar world order, which would be more just, more equitable, opposing US hegemony, also striving for the reform of global governance, and for a regional order in Eurasia, which would be cooperative in nature, so that the countries could join their developmental efforts and do it together. Also, we have seen that there is a great economic complementarity between Russia and China. And recently, we have seen Russia-China economic relations much more transformed, and actually they have witnessed a great progress. The same could be said about defense cooperation, which also demonstrates very robust ties. And of course, there is a very good personal chemistry between President Putin and President Xi, a lot of socializing between elites, and also very robust institutional-based cooperation between different agencies, which means that there is a solid foundation for regular engagement, which also helps both countries to minimize the areas of divergence and to maximize the areas of convergence of interests.
Mm-hmm. Well, Glenn, of course, we know that President Xi just got back from his European tour, three nations, France, Serbia, and Hungary there. China is improving its ties with the European nation. Right after that, we have President Putin in Beijing. Sitting in the European continent, how do you look at the visit?
Well, I think it's part of really putting forward the restructuring of the international economic system, because there's two things which has happened all at the same time over the past decade. The first, of course, is obviously China really rising forward now as the leading economy in the world. If you look at the technologies, the Belt and Road initiative with its transportation corridors, the new banks, diversifying currencies, all of this. But this huge rise of China to become the leading economy is happening at the same time as Russia has made a huge shift in its whole history. That is, throughout Russian history, it's always looked towards the West for development, ever since Peter the Great 300 years ago. Now, what happened in 2014 was that Russia effectively started to abandon this dream of a greater inclusive Europe, and instead started looking towards the East, and then primarily China as its main economic partner. So you have now this huge shift in history, and I think both China and Russia would like to see a multipolar world come into being, one which is much more fair. And this would have to have an economic foundation primarily. That is, many centers of power, diversifying the economic connectivity across the technologies and corridors, banks, all across, and all the supply chains as well. So I think they both have an interest in diversifying this, and this is why this partnership is so important, because not only does it mean that the Russians and Chinese are working towards transitioning into a multipolar system, but they're also leading the way for many other countries. If you mentioned a few Europeans, but of course countries like India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, they all want to diversify their economic connectivity. But I think at the core of this is really this Chinese-Russian partnership, which is driving this forward and effectively dismantling this hegemonic system which preceded it.
Well, significant effects there. So Leonid, if you listen to what the President Putin said in the interview with Tsinghua News Agency, right before his tour to China, he said China-Russia relationship had reached its highest level in history. So can we say this current visit is another move to reinforce this bilateral relationship there?
I think yes. It was told in historical context about the most high level of our cooperation. But I think in future we can to achieve more goals, and especially to build a multipolar world. Because if we remember, Chinese-Russian declaration about multipolarity and new world order was registered in United Nations just 15th of May 1997. So it passed 27 years, but still we see attempts of United States to keep unipolar hegemonic order over the globe. So it's very important to achieve new heights for Russian-Chinese cooperation, but also to bring more powers. I mean, Iran, Venezuela, and other countries who support ideas of multipolarity. And of course, there is also very big, huge potential for Russia and China for cooperation in economics, in security, and etc. And of course, to develop a cultural relation too.
Yes, let's break down the relationship and take a look at different sectors here. What's really happening between the two nations. Anna, if you look at trade, last year, 2023, registered the highest amount of trade between the two countries, 240 billion. The original goal was 200 billion for 2023, so that was achieved ahead of schedule, obviously. So. Are you surprised when you see this strong growth of trade between the two nations?
Well, no, because actually the geopolitical shifts that Glenn spoke about are the core reasons why we have seen such a rapid increase in trade. For Russia, now it is an imperative to diversify its trade from the West and from Europe because of economic sanctions. So it has been diversifying the trade to friendlier states. And of course, from these friendlier states, trends. China, as the largest economy with a high demand for resources, is a natural partner for Russia. That's why we have seen Russia reorienting much of its energy exports to China. And a huge share of this figure that we have seen rising in trade was Russia's export to China in terms of energy resources. Specifically, oil has seen major increase, but also coal and LNG. Also, Russia and China have, in the last several years, have signed and completed several new energy projects, and we can expect that this trend of increasing Russia's exports to energy exports to China will be seen also in the years to come. On the other side, we can clearly see that Russia also needs a replacement of different goods that it used to buy from Europe. And especially if we are talking about machinery, equipment, and different electronic goods, consumer goods, and probably Chinese automobile industry is the major beneficiary of these trends, as now Chinese automobile makers have emerged very recently, only just last year, as the largest foreign car makers in terms of the number of cars sold. So this is something really new that we have seen here in this relationship. Also, there is high demand in China for good green agricultural products. And again, we have seen agricultural export, Russian agricultural export on the rise to China. And I also think it is highly mutually beneficial sector.
Leonid, on that respect, do you find there is increase of the presence of Chinese products, let's say, in the Russian market?
Yes, we see many Chinese production in the Russian market, especially for last year. There we see many Chinese auto and IT technologies, etc. Not so many products for food, but I think it will be achieved in next year. For example, I have some expert on China who bring me some Chinese food, and I see it will be very useful in Russia. And especially, I think Russian market is very huge for China. And because many Western companies go out from Russia because of sanctions. And it will be a good chance for China to bring own products, own technologies, and own services to Russia. And not only to Russia, but also to Eurasian Economic Union. And today I know that Mr. Putin and Mr. Xi already discussed the idea to cooperate more between Belt and Road Initiative and between Eurasian Economic Union.
Yes, further integration of the different initiatives, focusing on trade and infrastructure there. Zhou Bo, what does Russia mean to China in terms of, say, energy security, food security? We know that there's a sharp increase, and also the potential is huge for agriculture and food products being exported to China or being imported from Chinese perspective from Russia. So in particular, I would say, of course, energy security, oil and gas. That's pretty easy to understand, important to China, let's say.
Yeah, I think so. You're actually talking about two types of things. If you're talking about the necessity of Russia exporting to China like agricultural products, I think it matters, but not in a big way, because China can still, import these kind of things from around the world, because Chinese economy is now really a global economy. Yeah, everybody just want to sell something to China. That is understood. But if you're talking about energy import, that is really the crucial thing, because Russia actually has overtaken Saudi Arabia as the largest energy exporter to China. Yesterday, we were talking about, new clean energies, but I believe in decades to come, China still needs this kind of gas and oil, because of China's economy depends so heavily on import of such energy. So therefore, I believe it is crucial for us to maintain good relationship, even for this kind of import of a strategic energy supply, because people are talking about other scenarios which may not seem so pleasant if we talk about energy import from the Middle East. If there is a kind of conflict, even right now in the Middle East, there is a conflict going on. So how might China's energies, import be affected? And with Russia's, a reliable and sustainable supply, China certainly would feel much more assured.
Yeah, long-term reliable supply. But at the same time, Glenn, we do see the challenges. For example, in March, I believe, of this year, you do see there's a slight reduction or decrease of trade. Partly, people would say because of the threat of the secondary sanction from Washington, there's challenges for banks, for example, to settle those trade. How big a challenge is that? Can China, Russia overcome that kind of challenge?
Yes, I think so. I mean, all pressure to some extent works, but you see, it's not just the pressure between China and Russia. They put the same pressure, for example, on India, and in all cases, we see that sometimes it can have a minor disruption, but in the medium to long term, we see that the countries then seek to overcome it, so learn to live without it. So, for example, with the Indians and Russians, they merely have to come up with new shipping systems, insurance systems in order to circumvent the sanctions, and then they begin effectively to build parallel economic architecture. Now, I think the same applies to China. So the main way America tries to go after China to reduce its trade with Russia is obviously going after its banks. But I think even in this aspect, there's a huge push now towards reducing the role of the US dollar in their trade, stop using the US banks, their payment systems. So there's a lot of ways to begin in the medium to long term to reduce the relevance of this pressure. And I think in the long term, that's also in the interest of both Russia and China, because, well, the main idea would be no dollar, no empire. And if you look at the US dollar, when this was first introduced to be so dominant, it was it was the main creditor state in the world, the main trading partner. These days we see a huge unsustainable debt. All economic dependencies are weaponized, and beyond this, the US can even tax the world when it prints new money and devalues the reserves that countries already hold. So for countries like China and Russia, which are the US sees as enemies, these two countries effectively using the US dollar, they finance their own military containment to some extent. So I think that as the US feels its hegemony under greater and greater pressure, it will use these sanctions more and more fiercely. And this only creates further incentives for the rest of the international system to begin and decouple. So I don't really think I think the pressure for the sanctions, while they have some effects, it will diminish over the long run. It's also a huge pressure for the Chinese, because it's not just about trading with Russia, but if they start to give in to the sanctions and let the Americans dictate who they can trade with, that's only going to embolden the Americans to effectively put even more pressure to try to dictate more to the Chinese what they're going to do. Furthermore, given that the objective of the Americans is to, as multiple American leaders and generals suggest when they talk about this war, the proxy war they're currently fighting against Russia, the main objective, they always say, is to knock out the Russians from the ranks of great power so they can focus all their resources and attention on China, to diminish the role of China. So effectively, when they're putting pressure on China to put sanctions on Russia, they're asking China to eventually help in its own destruction. So I don't think this will have any long-term effectiveness. Again, anyone can give a little bit into temporary pressures, which will have some trade sliding. But in the long run, I think both countries are looking for new ways to create an economic system which is much less dependent on the United States.
We'll come back and talk more about this politics there. Before that, Anna, there's of course this year and the next year, 2025, they are named, years of cultures between the two countries. So we are going to see probably a lot more interaction between the two peoples. For example, there's a survey, 87% of Russian people have a positive attitude toward China. And if you look at tourism, for example, in the first quarter of this year, you see that approximately 219,000 foreign tourists visited Russia. Nearly half of them are Chinese. So the potential, let's say this is only the first quarter, so there's huge potential for people-to-people exchange, between the two countries.
Yeah, sure. People-to-people exchange has also been very important to Russia-China relationship because they provide a solid social support for further cooperation. And that's why having more cultural contacts, having more sports contacts, also having more scientific and educational contacts is a very important task for Russia and China. And especially if we take culture, Russia and China, both countries which are famous for their culture. And here, bilateral ties have always worked to improve the image of each other. It has also been very important to have just ordinary people going, as you mentioned, to Russians to China and Chinese to Russia. And of course, tourism is another way to make the two countries closer. And we actually saw unprecedented figures before the pandemics. About 1.5 million of Chinese tourists visited Russia in 2019, which was a record ever. They also spent a lot, and according to Russian statistics, the tourist sector accounts for about 3.5% of Russian GDP, and there are plans to increase it to 5%. And here, the Chinese tourists who come in groups actually accounted for most of these 1.5 million people who visited Russia in 2019. So I think that what we should expect, first and foremost, is the restoration of this level. And the fact that we already have a visa-free agreement for tourist groups already in operation. All the restrictions have been lifted. Actually, it's bringing us to a bright future. But I think another area where there is work to be done is education exchanges, because this is something that we do have ties, but this is something that we definitely need to upgrade further. And it's very important now to have a lot of specialists who understand each other, not only, for example, in international relations, but especially in economics, also tourism, culture, and in other areas. And just not simply people who could translate, but people who have the professional knowledge and the command of the Russian language or the Chinese language. So this is something that we really need, because we need new specialists with professional knowledge, but also good understanding of each other. It seems that there is also a lot of work to be done on the level of business, so that business of the two countries could understand better how to, for example, Russian companies, how to do business in China and Chinese in Russia.
Yeah, we can also say there's a huge potential to tap, let's say. Zhou Bo, if you look at this relationship, overall relationship, you see, some Chinese analysts would call, China-Russia relationship, is a kind of represents a kind of a new paradigm of major power relationship in terms of interaction, cooperation, coordination. I mean, indeed, President Xi Jinping said, China-Russia ties, quote, set a model for major and neighboring countries in mutual respect, sincerity, harmonious coexistence, and mutually beneficial cooperation. they say this new paradigm is completely different from the old Cold War, which is confrontational. So how do you characterize this China-Russia relationship? Well, I know people often say it's not targeting a third country, not confrontation, not alliance. But how do you characterize this bilateral tie?
Well, I think this is something that we have to be extremely careful, because it is true that the China-Russian relationship is not one alliance, but people always forget that. Instead, people in the West would stress on this relationship to be kind of a unlimited partnership, and they just scolded this relationship for being unlimited in partnership. Actually, in my interview with Financial Times, I told them bluntly in this way: just imagine if I say I want to develop a good relationship with you, but hang on for a moment, this friendship has to be limited. What would you think? This would be very bizarre from the very beginning, right?
Right.
So this kind of expression is just an expression of goodwill. People always quote this, but people forgot almost deliberately that in the same statement, it is clearly mentioned that this kind of relationship is not one of alliance and is not directed against any third party. So I don't know why people would just describe this relationship like a finished chewing gum, right, on this relationship. So yes, you're right. Yeah, this definitely is a kind of a new relationship. It is not alliance. It's friendly and extremely important in that this is between two giants. Yeah, and other giants actually are somewhat worried. So this is the world we are living in.
Mm-hmm. Well, Leonid, this year Russia is hosting country for the BRICS summit. Actually, the larger BRICS summit, with 5 new members. So, what do we expect in terms of integration? Bring the 5 countries, into this original group of BRICS.
Yes, and because this year we have 2 new members in BRICS, so it will be important to develop relations with Ethiopia and with Egypt, and to discuss about newcomers for next year, because many countries interested to join BRICS because they see this entity like very good and working alternative to order proposed by Western powers. And I think that both Russia and China will be a good example how to cooperate inside BRICS club. And I am expecting that there will be a decision to develop and to install a new alternative international financial system, because we see that SWIFT controlled by Western power, and it's not for benefits of all actors in the world. So because of strategic thinking both of Russia and China, I think it will be very useful and very good for all countries and introduce a new financial system. And maybe on BRICS summit we will see some discussion on this process.
Of this program. So Glenn, of course, do we see, we are seeing the rise of the global South, a global majority. We have 5 members already being included with the expansion of BRICS. Are we going to see more countries joining this group?
Yeah, I think so, because many countries have grown very weary of the hegemonic system, because under this system there's only one center for technologies, one center for currencies, financial system. So it becomes excessive dependence on one side, and this is what we see when you hear from countries from India and Turkey. They would like to be able to diversify their economic partnerships, so they will have more autonomy over their foreign policy. And in this sense, we also see that BRICS represents something vastly different from in the past, which was just suggested. Because under hegemonic system, the world is always divided into dependent allies
there,
or adversaries.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.